Hi everybody, it's Joe Cioffi here on this Wednesday. Boy, is it cold, and we are seeing quite the Arctic air mass into the United States, and there's more to follow as we have another air mass set to come down over the weekend, and for the start of the new year that is actually colder than this one is, and some folks are not going to really see their temperatures bottom out from this current round of Arctic weather and this weather pattern until sometime around the middle of next week. With all this cold air, it's amazing how bone dry it is across much of the country. But this is what happens sometimes when you have a jet stream pattern like we have, where the cold air is just so overwhelming in the flow that there's just no room for anything else except for perhaps some weak systems running around, and that's pretty much what we see going through the weekend. But I want to start off with some current temperatures, and I'll take you around the country here. These are readings now as we approach the 6 o'clock Eastern time hour, and it's in the single digits, and in a few spots in northern Vermont and New Hampshire sitting at goose egg. And then you start to see these below normal temperature, below zero temperatures as you run up toward Montreal and Ottawa. In and around Boston, it's below 20. New York City temperatures are about to go under 20 degrees. And as we move down further south toward the Washington, D.C. area, we're in the upper 20s to around 30. And then you start to go above freezing, but not very far above freezing. I mean, we were seeing highs mostly in the 30s throughout much of North Carolina. Then you get into just 40s through much of Alabama, and of course we'll bring you a warm spot here, at least take you down into Florida, where we've got temperatures in the middle 70s in the southern half of Florida, and lower 70s and upper 60s as you go further north, and even upper 50s along the Panhandle. Back over we go. We'll look across the south, across the Gulf states. It's mostly in the low and middle 40s throughout much of Texas, and in through Louisiana you start to get to temperatures in the upper 30s here. So now we're in the central time zone, and we're talking about 5 in the evening. And as we head further north, you start to see 20s, teens, southern Illinois through Missouri into Kansas, and then you get into the single digits. It's looks like it's 5 above right now in Chicago, 8 in Detroit, Milwaukee. It looks like their temperature might be missing at this point, but it's probably close to 0 or 1 or 2. And of course, you go up into northwestern Wisconsin. Here we have a lot of below. That's where we start to see all the below 0 current temperatures throughout much of northwestern Wisconsin and through northern Minnesota. We've got readings between -10 and -15. Back through the Dakotas, single digits to near 10. Just keep bringing you further south through Nebraska. We're talking about single digits to some lower 20s as you go south and west. And back over we are into the Texas, Oklahoma Panhandle. Not that bad, though, in Colorado at the moment, because it looks like the Arctic boundary is just to your east. So it's 52 in Denver, while just not too many miles to the east, it's in the 20s. So the Arctic boundary is somewhere just east of the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. And as we move into the west, you start to see some temperatures that are actually rather mild throughout parts of Utah. We've got 50s and 60s and 70s across Southern California, and on up into the Pacific Northwest. It gets a little chilly, but nothing exceptional in the areas as you go in through Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. So you can certainly see the fact that much of the country right now is in the deep freeze, and we're going to stay in the deep freeze for a while, at least into the first part of next week. Now, with respect to any kind of wintertime weather that is in need of watches and warnings, the one place where we are seeing activity from that respect is up in the northern Rockies and in the Intermountain West, where we have winter storm warnings up for a good chunk of Montana and northern Idaho, Winter storm watches up for areas of the southeastern Montana and also into northern Idaho and northeastern Washington, and of course a peppering of winter weather advisories. For the east, it's some lake effect issues that are going on. South winds that are coming in off of Lake Erie. They've had up to 4.5 feet of snow in Erie, Pennsylvania in the last day and a half, and many of the lake effect areas getting hit rather hard south of Lake Ontario today because of the wind going around to the north. Other than that, the weather across the rest of the nation from that standpoint, yes, it's cold, but there's very little as far as storm activity is concerned. We do have some weak disturbances running around, and one of the important disturbance here, at least for my area of the Northeast, is this one that's out in the Atlantic. You see these clouds that are east of Virginia and the Delmarva Peninsula in New Jersey. There's a low here that's developed, and it's moving out to the east. It's not going to cause any snow issues, but that low moving northeast is actually helping to drag down. If you see the clouds up here to the north, how they're moving from north to south, it's not that the low's influence extends up there, but the whole connection between the upper air storm that's up to the northeast of Maine and the surface storm that's sitting up there, we're getting this system too as part of that, the gears and the wheels, so to speak, and it's pulling down the core of the Arctic air into the northeastern part of the United States and dragging it southward. So that's why we're going to be down in the single digits to near 10 tonight in many locations around me. 0 to 10 above is what I'm basically going for. The warmer urban areas might finish out around 11 or 12. But in spite of the fact that you see all these clouds down here across the south, there really isn't too much happening from the standpoint of precipitation. You have to go up into the northwest for that, where we do see some cloud cover moving into Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. You know, that's where we have those that peppering of winter storm warnings and winter weather advisories. So where do we go from here? Well, one of the things that I've said a number of times, and if you're new to the channel, first off, welcome, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm so close to 5,000 subscribers. I only need about 6 more. So if you're new, hit the subscribe button for me. But one of the things that we've been looking at and following closely are these teleconnections, basically describing pressure patterns across different parts of the northern hemisphere, and when they are in certain positions, be it positive or negative, there are certain combinations that lead to very cold conditions in the east, and we have one of those combinations in play at the moment. But one of the things that the models have done over the last number of days is that we've seen some flipping here of the teleconnections. There were some signals over the last 3 or 4 days, not consistent, but some signals on certain days were putting out the idea that we might see some moderation, and I think we will see some moderation off the extremes. However, today the teleconnections threw a bit of a surprise in that first off, the Pacific North America Index goes strongly positive after this weekend and shoots up to the top of the range here for the first 11 days of January. So this, when we see the PNA as positive, that is usually a strong indicator for potential storminess in the east. And when you combine that with the East Pacific oscillation, which now, after yesterday actually was shown to go slightly positive for later next week, today's models actually keep it negative pretty much right through the first 11 days of January. And a negative Eastern Pacific oscillation is a favorable pattern for colder weather in the eastern part of the United States, at least certainly during the winter time. So when you've got that plus PNA, the positive PNA, and the negative EPO, it would certainly suggest that below average temperatures are going to be the rule, and I think we're going to have to watch for the possibilities of snows along the way. Maybe the positive PNA puts a ridge out in the west, and that tends to put a trough in the east. So maybe the teleconnection models might be signaling that the the dominance of the northern jet may relax enough to allow for some weather systems to impact the northeast and to move on through. So that's something we're going to be watching very carefully as that evolves over the next week or so. So at this point, why don't we pull up the GFS itself, because I'm already seeing a few things that I was kind of picking up on in the last few days, and I think they're going to be important in the long range. So here is the big Arctic high this evening sitting over Wisconsin. We've got that little storm I was saying off the east coast. You can see how the isobars run from eastern Canada straight north to south. This is a northwest or northwest wind, which typically brings down very, very cold air. When the wind goes, sometimes when you get these cold air masses that come in from the west, from the northwest, the wind here where I am tends to go westerly, and that a lot of times keeps the temperatures from getting too low. But I don't think that will be the case this time, because with the isobars the way they are and the high where it is, we're going to get, the wind is going to have a bit more of a northerly component. That comes straight down the Hudson Valley of New York State, and that basically is bitter cold air. The flow is straight up from the north, up from Labrador, almost straight southward. So we're talking bitter cold air here. And when we get to tomorrow morning, I'm going to put up the 2-meter temperatures here so we can see just how cold it is going to be. And the areas in the white are the single digits, and of course you start to get into the brighter whites. You're talking below zero. Let's call it the super duper below zero temperatures are going to be up near the Canadian border. This first Arctic air mass that's coming down here now has probably reached its peak in terms of the cold. That's going to be coming into the northeast tonight and tomorrow. And then we wait for the second push, and you could start to see it here coming in Friday into the northern plains. You get those minus 20s for lows, and as we go into Saturday, that minus 20 area, let me just back up. This would be for 7 a.m. Eastern time. You can see those big area of between minus 20 and minus 30 into the Dakotas. The below zero temperature line continues to shift further south with that next push. Now we're into New Year's Eve, Sunday morning. Below zero across much of upstate New York and New England, across the Great Lakes, the northern parts of the Ohio Valley, and then back through all of the upper Midwest. Look at these numbers here, minus 33, minus 30, minus 25. I mean, this is really incredible cold. The freezing line runs right along 32 degrees north, it looks like. So northern Georgia, northern Alabama, on through Mississippi, northern Mississippi. At this point, there's warm, milder air coming up from the Gulf, so there's a bit of a frontal boundary that's setting up there that's going to produce some rain and snow that we'll get to in just a second. But here we are now through New Year's Eve night, and you can see a large chunk of the plains, the upper Midwest, the Northeast below zero, and by Monday morning, New Year's Day, that below zero line will be very close to New York City. It'll probably be below zero in Boston. It'll be in the single digits in Philadelphia and Washington. We've got below zero temperatures across Pennsylvania, minus 10 to minus 20 upstate New York and New England, minus 20 to roughly minus 20. That seems to be the bottom Monday morning across Nebraska, Iowa, northern Kansas, northwest Missouri, on through western much of the state of Wisconsin, and into almost into northwestern Illinois. Single digits into southern Missouri, single digits into Oklahoma, teens in down in through much of Texas, especially through North Texas. And of course in the west, not too bad. The freezing line is inland of the coast. We've got temperatures in the 40s and 50s across much of the southwest, so that's much better. And as we go into next week, you know, eventually you're going to run out of cold air to some degree, but there's another push. You'll notice it here along the Canadian border. Now, that how much of that comes down is going to be dependent on storm development in the eastern part of the United States and how deep a trough we wind up with. So that's a big question. But you can see another push of minus 10 and minus 20 up into the upper Midwest. This time around, the trough positions further east, so you can see the big minus signs are more just north of the lakes and in through southeastern Canada rather than coming in down through central Canada. And again, there's a push here along about later next week into upstate New York and down over into the southern parts, the northern parts of the mid-Atlantic states. Again, all of that is going to be dependent on what kind of a trough that we have in the eastern part of the U.S. So why don't we go back to the actual weather here, in terms of precipitation, and I'll show you. It's going to be pretty dry. We'll roll it along, and there you have going into Saturday. Now, we do have a disturbance in the northeast. The GFS does not pick up on this well, nor does the NAM. The European and the Canadian have a bit more of this. I'll switch to the Canadian so you can see, at least from the standpoint of precip. This area of snow in Iowa and Illinois and Indiana, there's an upper air disturbance that's swinging around the lakes. Now, I put in for the chance that there could be a coating to an inch or two in my area, which would cover basically eastern Pennsylvania through southern New England and all the spots in between. The Canadian is probably a shade overdone. The European shows the idea of maybe a coating to a couple of inches, so I sort of went along with that. The NAM, which earlier today showed maybe the same idea, late this afternoon came in and shows nothing, and the GFS has been showing nothing all along. So, we're talking a coating to an inch or two. If we wind up not getting it, I don't think, from a standpoint of credibility, a coating of an inch or two on a bust forecast, I don't think is a huge deal. This is a minor event. Sometimes these things with these systems along the coast like this, especially with the bitter cold air, can have a little bit of upside to them because the air is so bitterly cold that it doesn't take much moisture to put down, to suddenly produce a couple of inches of fluffy white snow. I mean, we're going to be talking about snowing in temperatures in the teens. So the snow ratio, instead of being 10 to 1, is probably going to be on the order of 20 to 1 or higher. 1 inch of rain is about 10 inches of snow. Well, in this case, because of the cold air, we're talking about 1 inch of rain being the equivalent of 20 inches of snow. So if you get a quarter of an inch of liquid, it could be 4 or 5 inches of fluffy white powder. A lot of the models are generally generating between 0.05 and 0.2, somewhere in there. We also have some snow going on. We have those winter storm warnings up in the Intermountain West, and we'll show you why. Because we do have a system that's coming in there with low pressure coming into the Pacific Northwest, and it kind of just disappears as we go into early next week, and you start to see ice developing across much of South Texas away from the coast, and snow up in North Texas. We'll have to see if this holds on in future model runs. But you know what? The cold air is so overwhelming, and the upper air flow is so strong that this is getting suppressed really far to the south, down in the Gulf of Mexico. And look at the GFS today, late this afternoon. It's got a stripe of ice from the coastal bend of Texas all the way through southern Louisiana, across southern Mississippi and Alabama. That's how suppressed and how far south the jet stream is. And you can't really get too much out of this. Now, going into the middle and latter part of next week, a low does try to come out of the Gulf states and suddenly starts to shoot up the East Coast. This is the Canadian model we're looking at, by the way. This is the European does kind of the same thing with this. This is for late Wednesday into Thursday, and it does produce a significant snow event. Both models do for the East Coast, but the Canadian has its idea here, and of course it's got very cold air that follows. The Canadian has its idea here, so let's switch to the GFS, because this, I think, really kind of highlights the problem. Here's, let me sequence the GFS for you. So here's our snow in the Rockies, which actually holds together a bit better as it drops southeastward, and then you start to see rain developing in East Texas and Louisiana. Now the GFS is a little less suppressed. It still pushes that cold air pretty far to the south, but it maybe is a shade further north, but even here the model showing that stripe of ice on the northern fringe as we move into New Year's Day. I mean, this really gets pushed down way into the Gulf of Mexico. And you start to see this low that's up in over Lake Michigan. That is the next trough that's swinging around. And I can tell you this, here the model has the low well out to the east. The prior run on the GFS was much further to the, was much further to the left. Do I have that on? I have a lot of trouble sometimes seeing. Here, let me see if we can get this to go. That is the 12Z. Okay, so let me just back it away. And see, on this run, the model was a little less suppressed with that system in the southeast, in the south, and bring some snow even into the southeast. So we'll have to figure out whether that's real or not. Now, you see that low here is in northwest Missouri, dropping southeast and east. Low develops along the coast and runs up just offshore. The model was actually further left with this during the overnight. So let me show you one of the things that that's been happening with the upper air, and this is why you pay attention early in the winter to see what kind of pattern develops, because oftentimes these patterns get played over and over again, and you find yourself seeing the same thing happen. First thing we've noticed that over the last couple of weeks, there's been very little interaction between the southern part of the jet stream and the northern part. Most of the activity that we've been dealing with has come as a result of the northern part of the jet stream, and I think that's going to remain the case. Weather systems are going to try and come out the same way. We've had a couple of them develop for my area, we'll call it my backyard, and this one for Saturday will be the same thing. But the issue, as we've been saying, has been a matter of room, and you don't really have too much room here. You've got this really strong northwest flow, and it's a fast flow. It's basically like a ruler from Lake Winnipeg to the mid-Atlantic coast. You've got no inflow here from the Atlantic. You've got no inflow here at all from the Gulf of Mexico, and the energy is pretty flat. It's not like you have, like if you go back up into the Pacific Northwest, you see, where the flow makes like this little U shape in the contours. There's there's an upper air disturbance here that's working through. There's a distinct solid kink in these height lines here, so there's some decent energy. You don't have that here in the east. It's pretty flat, so you really can't get too much to happen. And I think that is going to be the general theme at least into next week. The other thing that models have been doing is that when they do show a trough dropping into the east, if you think back last week when we had the 2,500 mile long warm front that the GFS was advertising, and we told you what nonsense that was. Well, one of the things I've noticed is when we've had the models trying to make troughs out in the west, in reality those troughs keep coming further and further east, and this is something that occurred today. So here's the trough on the GFS for the end of the week, and actually this is off the 12Z run. You can see it's not half bad looking. I mean, in terms of the structure here in the upper air when it gets to the eastern part of the United States. The European has something even more impressive. It has a very deep trough, just getting ready to go negative here along 80 degrees west. But the new GFS, on the other hand, is doing something that the models have been doing for the last couple of weeks when we've seen these systems in the long range, and that is suddenly, as we get closer and closer, the troughs, instead of dropping in, way to the west, they drop in further east. And here it is on this model run. It's much further east, and it drops in, so the trough is now almost on the east coast rather than, say, dropping down near the Mississippi River. Let's say if it dropped in along 90 west or even 85 west. So we keep seeing these systems coming in as we get closer and closer to potential events being weaker and much less defined in terms of their structure on the upper air, and I would expect that trend continues. Now, just a quick view here of the long range as we pull up all of North America. So I'm out here at day 10. So after whatever goes on late next week pulls out, we do see kind of a short break, a little bit of ridging here in the east, but another major trough, and that ridge just flies back up in the west in the long term. So this would sort of argue that we could, might have a very brief period of moderation for a day or two if we take this run literally, by the way. Doesn't guarantee that this is going to be like this, obviously, but it does at least maintain the signature of the pattern that we've been in. And as I showed you with the teleconnections, that change that we saw today from the last couple of days may be significant. The pattern may want to stay like this for a while. One of the other things I've noticed too lately is that the models the last few days want to try to change the pattern somewhat late in the period as we go towards, say, days 14, 15, and 16, and every day it pushes it back another day. So here we have a shot, for example, on day 16 with a trough now off the west coast. We have troughing off the west coast, and the vortex kind of pulls up toward the Arctic region, so cold air gets sort of cut off here. That was the current run. If we go back a run, it's a little bit different. Okay, it's a bit of a colder look here in the longer term, although it's not very cold, but it is a colder look overall. So one of the things that the models will do sometimes is, late in the forecast period, it'll start to show that there's going to be some kind of change, when in reality, every run says no, it's not this day, it's the day after, and then it becomes the day after that, and the day after that. This happened so many times last winter, where it just pattern change shows up and it just keeps getting put off because the primary pattern remains ever so dominant. So very interesting times. Remember, folks, just because you got all this cold air, there's nothing, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be storm activity. And apparently, at least for now, it seems to be that that northern jet is just way too dominant. It has to kind of rearrange itself a little bit to allow for a bit more room. Meanwhile, we'll go to Europe and see what's going on there, because I heard from my buddy Jason Smith in England, because they had some snow today, and they had some snow last night, and they were going to get some today. So let's see what the GFS has to say with this. And you can see there's a weather system that's in the North Sea that's pulling out, so their snow is ending. Another low comes in, a pretty deep low comes in north of Ireland on Friday. Looks like some snow for Scotland, and then you get some more waves of rain with perhaps some snow in the higher elevations in up in northern Scotland. But at least for now, the blocking that produced the very cold air back in earlier December is absent, so we're not seeing too much of that going forward. Although as we get toward looks like around day 8 or 9, we get some flow from up near Greenland that brings in a little bit of cold air, but still a fairly stormy North Atlantic. The absence of blocking is so important for the weather in Western Europe, because when you don't have it, it's a little tougher to bring the cold air down from the northwest. You get that maritime cold air, which gets modified to some degree due to the relatively warm ocean waters there. We're talking relatively warm, and they're still cold by my standards. We go look at southeastern Canada through this period, because of all this, this strong Arctic jet that's just to the south of this region could be certainly bullish for some snow. And the first map I pull up is out at day 9, which has a storm south of Nova Scotia. So why don't we see how we get there? I'll go back to the beginning for a current time. So we've got this low that's sitting east of Labrador that's been kind of rotating around there for the last day or two. That's pulling out. And then we have the weekend system that's going to be developing, running out well to the south and east. So it looks fairly dry and tranquil with just occasional snow showers there until we move, I think, maybe beyond. So now we're at January 4th, and this is where we start to see, this is that low that the models were telegraphing along the East Coast, and it actually brought in a fairly sizable snowfall to parts of Nova Scotia here before the low gets deflected to the east-northeast, and heavy snows for Newfoundland as it moves out into the open waters of the Atlantic. So that right now is in the long term, and it's going to be dependent on that ridge in the eastern part of the U.S., and we, in the meantime, are just going to have to wait and see how models trend with this. But as I said before, the trend, what we've seen, how these models have behaved up until now, and we've seen the overall trend with these systems, is that they show up strong on the long range, and then they kind of peter out when they get into the short range. And I'm going to say that idea is going to continue until such time that it stops. Basically the trend is your friend. That's something that as a forecaster I've always held on to. If any of you are young forecasters on here, let me just tell you that that is something to really pay attention to. The trend is your friend, and things do tend to repeat. If you can figure out what the pattern is early enough in the wintertime, you can really beat the pants off your competition in terms of your forecast accuracy once you recognize that pattern. So let me just say hello to everybody collectively, but I want to specifically say hi to Corey Bodziak, who I haven't seen in a bit. Good to see you. And yes, it is very cold out here. Corey's in my neck of the woods. And to Dio Nandkumar, Merry Christmas to you too. I haven't seen you in the last couple of days. Good to see you back. And doing good, David Fuller, Adam Fitz, Scott Olson. Oh, I got to say thank you to Kevin Francis for hitting Super Chat. I really appreciate it. That'll be a nice hot chocolate for me tonight over at Starbucks, or as I like to call Starbucks, $4. So you guys have gotten a good flavor for the temperatures that we have all across the United States. And yes, Erie, Pennsylvania, Adam Fitz really got creamed with 50 inches plus of snow. So we don't have any big storms to talk about going into this weekend, and I'm just gonna have to focus on that small event that we have coming into the east. The temperatures are the big story. Sean K, thank you very much. So it's a hot chocolate, and maybe put it toward the cigar for later. How's that? Thank you so much. Jason Small Arts. I hope I got that right. Moderation, you have to be kidding, right? This is the eastern U.S. It never warms up here. Jason, I got to tell you, there are a lot of winter weather freaks and snow lovers who are actually not appreciating the weather that we have. And when I say appreciate, what I mean is, a number of folks that are on my Facebook page, and I guess a number of you here, are winter weather lovers and snow lovers, and you love snowstorms, and I totally get that, because I do personally love to see snow falling. I think it's one of the prettiest things. It's kind of I always often say that it's sort of like God's way to just kind of make everything peaceful for a little while. There's nothing more peaceful than waking up in the morning to a fresh snowfall and just seeing some flakes coming down from the sky. It's like there's a certain quietness about it. Well, we're in an extreme pattern here with the cold, and certainly we've had 3 small events in terms of snowfall here in the month of December in my neck of the woods, but we've got above normal snowfall for the month, and we're going to have below normal temperatures for the month as well, because the weather these last few days and going into the last days of the year will more than offset the warm weather that we had during the first week of December, and apparently it's just not enough for them. The winter is horrible, they're saying. It's not cold, it's not snowing. It's like, you got to be kidding me. We've got anomalies in the -20 to -30 range. What do you think? What more do you want? You're at the far end of the curve here. Okay, as far as snow is concerned, that's a whole nother matter. And last year we had a fairly warm winter. We still had above normal snowfall because the snow came at the right time when the cold air was around. Here we're kind of in the opposite problem. We have all this bitter cold air. We have no room. That northern jet has got to get out of the way for there to be room. Mike Bologna, the EPO looks negative through weeks on. We can have the coldest, longest below normal streak in decades. Okay, well, let's just kind of go at this one at a time. I will tell you that, because I remember, at least from stats that I kept back in January of 77, I went the entire month of January where the temperature, and into the first few days of February, and in fact, that streak actually began maybe right after Christmas that year, but it was about 40 some odd days where the temperature only went above freezing for about 2 hours on January 12th, and only because we had a coastal low. It wound up being a coast hugger, and it changed over to rain, and the temperature jumped to 34 for a couple of hours, and that was it. So that was a pretty long stretch, and all those days, it was something like 40 or 45 days in a row of below average temperatures. We gotta, let's take this a week at a time. We're going to be below average probably through all of next week, so that's going to give us this week and next week, so we're talking 14, 15 days in a row. If we go beyond that, I don't think we can see that far out. But, you know, I tend to think that we're obviously not going to, we're not going to have this extreme cold nonstop. There has to be, you know, some sort of atmospheric reloading at some point. But, you know, could we wind up with, in general, below normal temperatures for at least the first half of January? I think it's probably a pretty good bet that that's going to happen because of, and it may be a little front-end loaded because of where we're going to be at the first 3 or 4 days, but on the whole, it may happen. A prominent Boston meteorologist, Tom Adams, says, is forecasting a traditional January thaw and a relatively mild February and March with normal or below normal snow. I would suggest, I don't know who this prominent Boston meteorologist is. I'd be curious to know who it is. I know what he might be looking at. I mean, some of the longer range models actually have January as being above average and February as being extremely mild, but I will tell you that those same models also had November and December being milder than average. So, you know, this is why I don't like doing the long range stuff, the long range stuff, because you know, without knowing who this is, and I'm not at all trying to disparage whoever the person is. I don't know what he's looking at. You know, is he doing this simply because he saw the climate models that are on Tropical Tidbits and saw that they were above normal and decided that that was the case? Is he doing deeper work? Does he see, you know, changes in the total upper air structure? I don't know. But this is why I don't like looking at the long range, because I don't, you know, I could say yes and be completely wrong. What good does it do? It takes the fun out of what we're doing here, you know. So I'm going to say I don't concur, mainly because I can't get my head around it. I'm kind of focused on the next 10 days to 2 weeks. I see, you know, what's out there, and that's good enough for me. I don't want to go, you know, any further than that. But I'd be curious as to who it is. Goose7799. Yeah, my suit does look pretty good. I got a nice jacket and tie on. I got my 7 o'clock show coming up in a little while, but we've got some time. Mirtha remembers 77, out of school for almost 2 months, and you were out of school for 2 months, and my husband said 45 days. Okay, Mirtha, I'm kind of not understanding that. Maybe you could just kind of elaborate on that a little bit. Ryan Ford wants to know, if the cold air is the dominant feature, why can't the storm system get caught up in the northern jet and produce a decent snowfall for the Northeast? Ryan, you need the trough to bend. You got this ruler flow that's straight northwest. It's completely flat. You know, when you look at these, you know, weather systems where we have stuff going on, when you look at the upper air, the jet stream is shaped more like a V, okay? You've got the bottom of the V being the base of the trough, so it's V-shaped. You look at the flow on the upper air charts now, it's not like that at all. It's like a fire hose. There's nothing, there are no kinks in there. There's no indentation of the flow. You don't have, you know, convergence going on, and you don't have, in other places you don't have divergence going on. You've got everything all wrong. The jet is too strong. There's no room for something to come along and kind of dent that flow a little bit, get some lift, get some inflow. The Atlantic Ocean is cut off. The Gulf of Mexico is cut off. So it's not that simple. You got the cold air. It happens sometimes. You have so much cold air, is so overwhelming that there's just no room for anything else, and that's basically what we have right now at the moment. That is not necessarily going to stay the rest of the winter, but that's not going to stay that way for the rest of the winter. Mike Bologna thinks that the Mets is at WBZ in Boston. Eric Fisher. Oh, okay. Well, you know what? I have heard of Eric Fisher. I don't know. I don't know what his work entails. So it's hard for me to really then comment on what he's doing, and particularly because I don't really look at the long range very much. So that's what he sees, and hey, it's a forecast. He may be right, and he may be wrong. That's about the best I can do here. But I don't have my brain is short range oriented. I just don't like looking at the long range. I don't have fun that way. I enjoy much more looking at all these weather systems and how they evolve, and what could happen, and how the upper air changes in the short range. And I just don't, I'll worry about February when I get there, and I'll worry about March. And you know what? Even if that's the case, after last year, I bet you we still have opportunities. So even if it does warm up, at least that means we can burn less oil, and that still doesn't mean we can't, have snow chances along the way. Look, all this cold air right now, we've got very little from the standpoint of snow. So if you're a winter weather lover and a snow lover, you're looking at this and saying, what good is all this? It's you're wasting all this cold air. Or worse, it could be cold for the next 2 weeks, and then when we finally get an event to break through the pattern and bring moisture to the east, it warms up and rains. And I've seen that happen too. All right, folks, you know what? We've gone 42 minutes, and we did a lot today. So I'm glad everybody was here. Get me over the 5,000 mark. If you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, hit the subscribe button. I only need a couple more, and it would be great. And it doesn't cost you anything, and you get notified every time there's a new video, a new live stream, or when I post a new video, which I did the other day on Christmas Day, because I didn't know if I was going to be able to get a live stream done. I'm sorry, was it Christmas Day or maybe it was Christmas Eve? I'm losing track at this point. Oh well. Anyhow, I think it was Christmas Day. Okay, so tomorrow, 6 o'clock Eastern Time, we'll be back at it again, and same for Friday. I am also going to see if we can bring the Joe Cioffi show up here on YouTube and maybe do a live stream of that at some point. My colleague Joe Rayo and my friend Joe and I have known each other for 40 years. We started as young meteorologists together, and career-wise, and after kind of going different ways, we've come back together again, and I guess we're going to finish our careers together, which is a great thing. So tonight I'll be on at Facebook at 9:15 Eastern Time, so you can catch another live stream there on my Facebook page, Meteorologist Joe Cioffi. And of course, you can always check out the latest posts on the website, meteorologistjoecioffi.com. My other partner at my other website is Angry Ben, and that's nycweathernow.com. All right, folks, stay warm. Have a great evening. We will see you either later on Facebook or tomorrow right here on my YouTube channel.